In the summer of 1944, across the blood-soaked fields of Belarusia, a sergeant lay trapped in a crumbling trench, while German artillery turned the earth into a graveyard. What follows is not merely a story of war, it is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of men who chose brotherhood over orders, courage over survival, and honor over everything they were taught. This is about the moment when one man inside a T-34-85 tank made a decision that defied every military protocol, every chain of command, and every instinct of self-preservation. Stay with this story until the very end, because within its depths lies something you have been searching for, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, when all seems lost, there exists within the human soul an unconquerable fire that refuses to be extinguished. As Napoleon Bonaparte once declared, the battlefield is a scene of constant chaos. The winner will be the one who controls that chaos, both his own and the enemy's. What you are about to witness is the story of men who seized that chaos and bent it to their will. The morning of June 23, 1944, broke over the Belarusian forests with an unnatural stillness the kind that seasoned soldiers had learned to distrust. Sergeant Alexei Volkov pressed his back against the muddy wall of his trench, his fingers wrapped around his PPSH-41 submachine gun with the desperate grip of a man who had seen too many comrades fall. The soil beneath him was cold and wet, saturated with 3 years of blood and rainfall, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of German panzer engines promised that the silence would not last. Operation Bagration had begun, the massive Soviet offensive designed to shatter Army Group Center and drive the fascist invaders from the motherland once and for all. Alexei had been part of the initial assault, pushing through German defensive lines with his rifle company, but the counterattack had been swift and brutal. Now he found himself separated from his unit, trapped in a forward trench with only 7 rounds remaining and the screams of wounded men echoing across no man's land. In war, there is no substitute for victory. Douglas MacArthur, 100 meters to the east, hidden within a copse of shattered birch trees, tank driver Private First Class Dmitry Sorokin wiped the grime from his periscope and surveyed the battlefield with growing horror. His T-34-85, affectionately named Natasha by the crew, sat motionless under camouflage netting, awaiting orders that seemed to have been swallowed by the chaos of the offensive. The tank's engine idled with a low growl, its 500 horsepower diesel heart ready to surge forward at a moment's notice. But without direct orders from command, Dmitry was bound by military protocol to hold position. Through the smoke and dust that choked the morning air, he could see the German positions, a network of trenches and bunkers bristling with machine gun emplacements and the unmistakable silhouettes of anti-tank guns. And there, caught in the middle of this killing ground, Dmitry spotted movement in a shell crater that made his blood run cold. A Soviet uniform, a single man, alive, desperately trying to find cover as German soldiers began advancing toward his position. The temperature inside the T-34 had already climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, gun oil, and the particular metallic tang that came from spent shell casings. Dmitry's loader, a young Georgian named Vaktin, leaned forward and pressed his eye to the secondary periscope, his breath catching as he spotted the trapped soldier. The gunner, an older Ukrainian veteran named Stepan, who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, said nothing. His silence spoke volumes about the grim mathematics of war that had become second nature to tank crews on the Eastern Front. Every man knew the risks. Every man understood that stopping to rescue one soldier could doom an entire crew of 4. And yet, as Dmitry watched the German infantry closing in on the helpless sergeant, something ancient and fierce began to stir within his chest, something that transcended orders, protocols, and the cold logic of military strategy. Courage is not having the strength to go on. It is going on when you don't have the strength. Theodore Roosevelt, Alexei could hear them coming. The distinctive crunch of German jackboots on rubble, the sharp commands barked in that harsh, guttural language that had become the soundtrack of nightmares for every Soviet soldier. He counted at least a dozen sets of footsteps, maybe more, and his 7 rounds suddenly felt impossibly inadequate against such odds. The trench he had taken refuge in was barely more than a ditch, carved hastily into the earth during some previous engagement, and now serving as his final defensive position. His left leg throbbed where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his calf during the morning's assault, and the makeshift bandage he had wrapped around the wound was already soaked through with blood. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony radiating up through his hip, but Alexei forced himself to remain still, to conserve every ounce of energy for the fight that would inevitably come. He thought of his mother in Leningrad, of the letters he had promised to write but never finished, of all the small moments of life he had taken for granted, before the world erupted into this endless symphony of death and destruction. The weather had been merciless for days. Heavy rains had transformed the Belarusian landscape into a sea of mud that sucked at boots and tank treads alike, and the air was thick with moisture that made every breath feel like drowning. Low clouds hung over the battlefield like a shroud, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of pale sunlight that seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of such carnage. The mud clung to everything: uniforms, weapons, faces, until soldiers on both sides became indistinguishable from the earth they fought upon. This was the reality of Operation Bagration, not the clean, decisive campaign depicted in headquarters maps and official reports, but a brutal slog through terrain that seemed determined to consume every army that dared to cross it. And somewhere in the middle of this apocalyptic landscape, two men were about to forge a bond that would defy every rule of warfare. The more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. Richard Marcinko inside the tank, Dmitri's hands trembled against the steering levers. He had driven this machine through hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, had felt the impact of shells against its armor, had watched through his periscope as German soldiers fled before its advance. But never before had he faced a decision like this one. The orders were clear: maintain position until the armored column reformed for the next phase of the offensive. Radio communications had been sporadic at best, jammed by German interference and the natural chaos of such a massive operation. But the last transmission had been explicit: no independent actions, no deviation from the battle plan. To disobey would be to risk not only his own life, but the lives of his entire crew. Court-martial, execution, disgrace. These were the consequences that every Soviet soldier understood intimately. And yet, as Dmitri watched the German soldiers draw ever closer to the trapped sergeant, he felt something within him beginning to crack. Vaktin was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper in the cramped confines of the turret. He said that they could not simply watch a brother die, that some things mattered more than orders. Stepan remained silent, his weathered hands resting on the elevation wheel of the 85mm cannon. But Dmitri caught the slight nod of his head in acknowledgement, born of shared suffering and unspoken understanding. The crew of Natasha had survived together through the hell of Kursk, through the grinding advance across Ukraine, through countless battles that had killed lesser men and destroyed lesser machines. They had become more than comrades, they had become family, bound by blood and fire in ways that peacetime civilians could never understand. And now, faced with the choice between safety and honor, between obedience and humanity, the family voted without words. Dmitri's hands stopped trembling, his jaw set with newfound determination. He reached for the engine throttle and felt the diesel roar to life beneath him. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. Theodore Roosevelt, the T-34-85 burst from its concealment like a predator unleashed, 32 tons of Soviet steel and righteous fury tearing through the shattered tree line with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Dmitri pushed the throttle to maximum, feeling the tank surge forward with all the power his Vita engine could muster, while Stepan swung the turret toward the advancing German infantry. The first shot from the 85mm cannon split the morning air with a thunderclap that announced their presence to every soldier within kilometers, and the shell detonated among the German formation with devastating effect. Vaktin worked the loading mechanism with practiced efficiency, slamming another round into the breech before the echoes of the first shot had faded. The machine guns mounted on the hull began their deadly chatter, raking the German positions with streams of 7.62mm fire that cut through flesh and fabric alike. This was not a rescue mission anymore. This was a statement, a declaration that some bonds could not be broken by orders or fear. Alexei heard the tank before he saw it, the distinctive rumble of a diesel engine, so different from the gasoline-powered German panzers, cut through the chaos of battle like a beacon of hope. He risked raising his head above the trench line and saw the most beautiful sight of his entire war: a T-30 for charging across the open ground, its cannon blazing, its machine guns sweeping the German positions with withering fire. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as Alexei watched this iron angel descend upon his enemies, scattering them like leaves before a storm. The Germans who moments ago had been advancing with such confidence now dove for cover, their carefully planned assault dissolving into panic and confusion. Some tried to flee, the tank's machine guns found them. Others attempted to bring anti-tank weapons to bear, Stepan's cannon spoke again, and another explosion tore through the German lines. This was not supposed to happen. Tanks did not break formation for single soldiers. Crews did not risk court-martial for strangers. And yet here was proof that everything Alexei had been taught about the cruel mathematics of war was incomplete. Bravery is being the only one who knows you're afraid. David Hackworth, the tank, skidded to a halt beside Alexei's trench, its massive tracks throwing up great waves of mud that splattered across his face. A hatch clanged open, and a voice shouted down to him, a voice thick with Georgian accent that somehow managed to convey both urgency and warmth in equal measure. Vaktin extended his arm, his face blackened with smoke and grime, his eyes burning with an intensity that Alexei would remember for the rest of his life. The sergeant did not hesitate. Ignoring the screaming protest of his wounded leg, he grabbed the offered hand and hauled himself up onto the tank's hull, fingers scrabbling for purchase on the rain-slicked armor. Round them, the battle continued to rage. German small arms fire pinged off the tank's steel hide, and somewhere in the distance, Alexei could hear the distinctive crack of an anti-tank gun being brought into position. But in that moment, suspended between earth and sky, between death and deliverance, all he could focus on was the strength of the hand that pulled him toward safety. Dmitri did not wait for Alexei to secure himself properly before slamming the tank back into motion. The anti-tank round that screamed past their turret confirmed the wisdom of this decision. Its passage so close that Stepan felt the heat of its trajectory through the armor. The loaders had slammed shut behind Alexei as Vaktin pulled him inside, and suddenly the sergeant found himself tumbling into the hellish confines of a Soviet tank in combat. The heat was suffocating, the noise deafening, and the smell of curdite and diesel so thick it seemed to coat his lungs with every breath. But he was alive, against all odds, against every principle of military strategy, against the cold calculations of acceptable losses. He was alive. And as he looked at the faces of the three men who had risked everything to save him, Alexei felt something shift within his soul, a realization that true courage was not found in following orders, but in knowing when to defy them. We are not retreating, we are advancing in another direction. Douglas MacArthur, the journey back to Soviet lines was a nightmare of close calls and desperate maneuvers. German positions that had been bypassed during the initial assault now came alive with fury, their crews determined to exact revenge for the audacity of this lone tank and its impossible mission. Dmitri drove like a man possessed, weaving between shell craters and burning wrecks, using every trick he had learned through 3 years of armored warfare. Stepan's cannon never stopped firing, selecting targets with the cold precision of a surgeon, while Vaktin worked the loading mechanism until his arms screamed with exhaustion. Alexei, pressed against the hull with his wounded leg twisted beneath him, could do nothing but watch and pray and marvel at the seamless coordination of these three strangers who had become his salvation. They moved together like extensions of a single will, anticipating each other's needs without words, their individual fears subsumed into the collective purpose of survival. This was what were created, Alexei realized, not just death and destruction, but bonds forged in fire that could never be broken. The physical toll of the escape was evident on every face within the cramped turret. Dmitri's hands, burned from a close encounter with overheated controls, gripped the steering levers with white-knuckled determination. Stepan's eyes, red-rimmed and bloodshot from the smoke and strain, never wavered from his periscope as he tracked the endless stream of threats that materialized from every direction. Vaktin's uniform was soaked through with sweat, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he maintained the relentless rhythm of load, fire, and Alexei, despite his wounds and exhaustion, found himself helping wherever he could, passing ammunition, calling out targets, becoming part of this unlikely crew through the simple act of shared struggle. The mental strain was perhaps even worse than the physical. Every moment brought new decisions, new calculations of risk and reward, new choices between paths that could lead to safety or destruction. There was no time for doubt, no space for hesitation, no luxury of second-guessing. There was only the next second, the next shell, the next desperate maneuver. I hated every minute of training, but I said, don't quit. Suffer now and live the rest of your life as a champion. Muhammad Ali, the emotional weight of what they had done, began to settle upon the crew as they neared friendly lines. Dmitri, who had driven in focused silence throughout the escape, suddenly found his vision blurring with tears he could not explain. Vaktin, the youngest among them, began to shake with the delayed reaction of terror and relief that overwhelmed soldiers after battle. Even Stepan, the unflappable veteran who had seen horrors that would break lesser men, allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, a single, choked sob that seemed to release years of suppressed grief. They had broken every rule. They had defied orders. They had risked court-martial, execution, and the condemnation of their comrades. And they had done it without hesitation, because some things mattered more than survival, more than protocol, more than the cold logic of military necessity. Alexei watched these men struggle with the enormity of their choice, and he understood that he was witnessing something rare and precious, the moment when ordinary soldiers transcended their circumstances to become truly human. The T-34 finally crossed into Soviet-controlled territory as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed almost inappropriate for such a battlefield. The sounds of combat faded behind them, replaced by the relative quiet of the rear areas where supply trucks rumbled along muddy roads, and field hospitals struggled to cope with the flood of casualties from the offensive. Dmitri brought Natasha to a halt near a command post, and for a long moment, none of the crew moved. They sat in the stifling heat of the tank, breathing the thick air, listening to the tick of cooling metal, and processing the reality that they had survived. It was Alexei who broke the silence. He reached out and placed his hand on Dmitri's shoulder, a simple gesture that conveyed gratitude beyond the capacity of words. The driver turned to look at this stranger they had saved, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended rank, unit, and the arbitrary boundaries that war had created. The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. G.K. Chesterton, the confrontation with command was as inevitable as it was brutal. Within hours of their return, the crew of Natasha found themselves standing before an NKVD political officer, whose cold eyes held no appreciation for heroism or brotherhood. The charges were read with mechanical precision: abandonment of assigned position, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, reckless endangerment of state property, and disobedience of direct orders. Each accusation fell like a hammer blow, and Alexei watched as the three men who had saved his life stood rigid under the weight of Soviet military justice. The punishment for such crimes was well-known: execution by firing squad, or if the officer was feeling merciful, transferred to a penal battalion where life expectancy could be measured in days rather than weeks. Dmitri's face remained impassive throughout the reading, but Alexei could see the slight tremor in his hands, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. This was the true cost of courage in Stalin's army, not the bullets of the enemy, but the pitiless machinery of one's own command. But the story did not end there. Word of the rescue had spread through the ranks with a speed that only soldiers' gossip can achieve, and the tale of the tank that broke formation to save a trapped sergeant had become something of a legend among the men of the offensive. Officers who had witnessed the engagement came forward to testify about the tactical brilliance of the maneuver, about the precision of Stepan's gunnery, about the courage displayed under impossible circumstances. Common soldiers, men who understood the stakes better than any political officer, began to speak openly about what they had seen and, more importantly, what they wished they had the courage to do themselves. The narrative began to shift. What had been insubordination became initiative. What had been recklessness became tactical brilliance. The machinery of Soviet propaganda, always hungry for heroes, recognized an opportunity. Within weeks, the crew of Natasha had been transformed from criminals awaiting execution to symbols of Soviet brotherhood and fighting spirit. Every battle is won before it is fought. Sun Tzu. The weeks that followed were filled with continued fighting as Operation Bagration swept westward across Poland, driving the German forces before it in the greatest defeat the Wehrmacht had ever suffered. The crew of Natasha fought in engagement after engagement, their reputation growing with each battle, their bonds strengthening through shared hardship and triumph. Alexei, his leg healed enough to return to duty, requested and received transfer to an infantry unit that supported the armored advance, keeping him near the men who had saved his life. He found himself visiting Natasha whenever the front lines permitted, bringing whatever small luxuries he could scrounge: tobacco, letters from home, the occasional bottle of vodka that had somehow escaped the notice of supply sergeants. The tank crew welcomed him like a brother, and around the warmth of shared fires in the cold nights, they told stories of home, of families left behind, of dreams for a future that seemed both impossibly distant and worth fighting for. The landscape of Belarusia and Poland became a blur of ruined villages, shattered forests, an endless field scarred by the passage of armies. The weather shifted from summer heat to autumn chill, and the mud that had defined the early days of the offensive transformed into the first hard frosts that heralded the approach of winter. Through it all, the bond between Alexei and the crew of Natasha remained unbroken, a beacon of humanity. Amid the dehumanizing machinery of total war, they learned each other's fears and hopes, shared the small victories and crushing defeats that marked the daily existence of soldiers at the front, and discovered that the connection forged in those desperate minutes of rescue had grown into something profound and permanent. This was not mere gratitude or obligation. This was brotherhood in its purest form, earned through fire and tempered by suffering. It is fatal to enter any war without the will to win it. Douglas MacArthur, the final battle of their shared campaign, came near a small Polish town, whose name none of them would remember. German forces, desperate to slow the Soviet advance, had established a defensive line anchored by Tigers and anti-tank guns that turned the approach into a killing ground. Natasha led the assault, her crew functioning with the seamless efficiency born of countless engagements, while Alexei and his infantry squad advanced in the tank's protective shadow. The fighting was intense, close-quarters combat that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Stepan's cannon spoke again and again, each shot precisely placed, while Dmitri maneuvered the tank with an artist's touch through the maze of obstacles and defensive positions. Vacting worked the loader's position like a machine, his movements automatic, his mind focused entirely on keeping the gun fed and firing. And Alexei, fighting alongside them once again, felt the familiar rush of battle merge with something deeper than knowledge, that whatever happened in the next minutes, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The German counterattack came without warning, a final desperate thrust that threw the Soviet advance into chaos. A Tiger tank, hidden in the ruins of a farmhouse, opened fire at point-blank range, and for one terrible moment, Alexei was certain that Natasha had been destroyed. The impact threw him to the ground, his ears ringing, his vision filled with smoke and debris. But when the dust cleared, the T-34 was still standing, its armor scarred but unbroken, its crew still alive through some miracle of engineering and luck. Dmitri reversed away from the Tiger's position while Stepan brought the cannon to bear, and the two tanks exchanged shots in a deadly duel that seemed to last an eternity. The Tiger's second shot glanced off Natasha's turret, and Stepan's return fire found the weak spot beneath the German tank's gun mantlet. The Tiger exploded in a pillar of flame that lit up the battlefield, and suddenly, impossibly, the German resistance crumbled. The advance continued. They had survived once more. The nation that will insist on drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is liable to find its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. Sir William Francis Butler, as the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion, Alexei found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He had entered the conflict as a young man filled with patriotic fervor and naive assumptions about glory and honor. The years of fighting had stripped away those illusions, replacing them with a harder, more cynical understanding of war's true nature. But the rescue that single moment, when three strangers had risked everything to save him, had restored something he had thought lost forever. It had shown him that even in the darkest corners of human experience, there existed the capacity for extraordinary compassion and courage. The decision that Dmitri had made in those desperate seconds was not about military strategy or tactical advantage. It was about recognizing another human being's worth and choosing to act upon that recognition regardless of the cost. This was the truth that Alexei carried with him through every subsequent battle, that the measure of a man was not found in his ability to follow orders, but in his willingness to stand for something greater than himself. The crew of Natasha continued to serve with distinction until the final days of the war, their tank bearing the scars of countless engagements, their souls carrying the weight of experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They fought through Poland, crossed into Germany, and were among the forces that closed the ring around Berlin in those chaotic final weeks. Through it all, the bond that had been forged on that June morning in Belarus remained unbroken, a testament to the power of human connection to transcend even the most inhuman circumstances. Alexei was with them for many of those battles, though the chaos of the final offensive often separated them for days or weeks at a time. But always, when the fighting paused and the guns fell silent, they found each other again, for men bound by something stronger than military discipline, deeper than patriotic duty, more enduring than the war that had created them. Victorious warriors went first, and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Sun Tzu, when the war finally ended, the four men stood together amid the rubble of a conquered capital, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces bearing the marks of years of combat, their eyes reflecting a weariness that no amount of rest would ever fully cure. They did not speak of what they had seen or done. There would be time for those conversations later, in the quiet years that followed, when the nightmares came and the memories demanded acknowledgement. Instead, they simply stood together, drawing strength from each other's presence, celebrating their survival with the silent gratitude of men who understood exactly how close they had come to never seeing this moment. The future stretched before them, uncertain and challenging, filled with the difficult work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by years of conflict. But they faced that future together, bound by a brotherhood that no force on earth could break. The story of the rescue became legend among Soviet veterans, passed down through generations as an example of courage and brotherhood in the face of impossible odds. But for Alexei, Dmitry, Vakting, and Stepan, the story was more than legend. It was the defining moment of their lives, the crucible in which their characters had been tested and proven. They maintained their friendship through the decades that followed, gathering whenever life permitted, their conversations inevitably returning to that morning in Belarusia when everything had changed. Each man carried the experience differently. Dmitry spoke of the moment of decision, the instant when fear and duty had collided and something deeper had emerged victorious. Stepan rarely spoke at all, but his silence conveyed more than words ever could. Vakting told the story with the enthusiasm of youth, even as the years claimed that youth and transformed him into an elder statesman of their small brotherhood. And Alexei listened to them all, forever grateful, forever humble, forever changed by the knowledge that his life had been saved by men who chose humanity over orders. Stay hard. Life is unfair. The only person who can save you is yourself. David Goggins. The lessons of that rescue extend far beyond the battlefield. They speak to something fundamental about human nature, the capacity for individuals to transcend their circumstances, to reach beyond fear and self-interest, to recognize the worth of another person and act upon that recognition regardless of the cost. In a world that often seems determined to reduce human interactions to transactions and calculations, the story of Natasha's crew stands as a reminder that something more is possible. Not everyone will face the stark choices of combat, but everyone faces moments when they must decide between safety and integrity, between compliance and courage, between the easy path and the right one. The crew of Natasha chose the harder path, and in doing so, they illuminated something essential about what it means to be truly human. Their example echoes across the decades, calling us to remember that within each of us lies the same capacity for courage and compassion that they demonstrated on that June morning in 1944. The battlefield has changed since those distant days, but the fundamental truths revealed in that rescue remain as relevant as ever. We still face moments when we must choose between following the crowd and standing for our principles. We still encounter situations where helping someone in need requires us to accept risk and uncertainty. We still struggle with the tension between self-preservation and moral obligation. The story of Alexei and the crew of Natasha does not provide easy answers to these dilemmas, but it does offer inspiration. It shows us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary acts when they allow their deepest values to guide their actions. It reminds us that the bonds formed through shared struggle and sacrifice are among the most precious things in human experience, and it challenges us to consider what we would do in similar circumstances, to ask ourselves whether we possess the courage to break the rules when breaking them is the only path to doing what is right. You can't hurt me. David Goggins. The physical and mental demands that the crew of Natasha endured during their rescue mission and the battles that followed serve as a testament to the limits of human endurance. They pushed through heat, exhaustion, fear, and pain that would have broken lesser men. They faced death repeatedly and continued fighting despite the psychological toll of constant combat. They discovered within themselves reserves of strength and determination that they never knew existed. This is perhaps the most important lesson of their story, that we are all capable of far more than we believe, that the limits we imagine are often nothing more than self-imposed barriers that crumble when we find a cause worth fighting for. The crew found that cause in each other, in a bond of brotherhood that transcended military hierarchy and strategic calculation. Their example challenges us to find our own causes, our own reasons to push beyond our perceived limits, our own sources of strength in the face of adversity. And so the story continues, passed from generation to generation, its details perhaps shifting slightly with each telling, but its essential truth remaining constant. A sergeant trapped in a trench, a tank that broke all the rules to save him, for men whose lives became intertwined through a single act of courage and compassion. The battlefield has long since healed, the trenches filled in, the shell crater smoothed by time and weather, but the memory endures, a light in the darkness, a reminder of what is possible. When ordinary people choose to be extraordinary, the war took so much from those who fought, it their youth, their innocence, their sense of safety in the world. But it also gave them something, the knowledge of their own capacity for courage, the experience of brotherhood forged in fire, the understanding that some things are worth any sacrifice. This is the legacy of Natasha's crew, and it is a legacy that belongs not just to them, but to all of us who hear their story and are changed by it. There's no talent here. This is hard work. This is an obsession. Talent does not exist. We are all equal as human beings. You could be anyone if you put in the time. Conor McGregor, the decision to act that singular moment when Mitri's hands stopped trembling and reached for the throttle was not the product of training or discipline. It was the expression of something far more fundamental, the recognition that a brother soldier's life held value that could not be calculated, that some debts were owed simply because we share the same humanity. In breaking the rules, the crew of Natasha upheld a higher law, the law of brotherhood that existed before armies and nations, that will continue to exist long after the last guns fall silent. Their story asks us to consider what rules we would break in service of that higher law, what risks we would accept, what sacrifices we would make. It is an uncomfortable question, one that forces us to confront our own limitations and fears. But it is also an empowering question, because it reminds us that the choice is always ours to make. We can follow orders and stay safe, or we can break the rules and save a life. We can accept the world as it is, or we can act to make it better, one courageous decision at a time. You have followed this story to its end, but the journey does not stop here. Within these words lies a truth that has echoed across battlefields and generations. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The crew of Natasha did not know if their rescue would succeed. They did not know if they would survive. They only knew that a brother needed them, and that some bonds are stronger than orders, stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. As you carry this story forward, remember that the same capacity for courage that drove Dimitri, step in, and acting to break every rule for a stranger lies within you as well. It waits only for the moment when you choose to unleash it. As George S. Patton once declared, courage is fear holding on a minute longer. In that minute, in that single, decisive moment, empires are toppled, history is written, and ordinary men become legends. The question is not whether such moments will come to you. They will. The question is whether you will be ready to answer them with the same unshakable resolve that saved a sergeant's life on a June morning in Belarusia, 1944. The battlefield awaits your decision. The story awaits its next chapter. And somewhere, in the depths of your soul, the fire that cannot be extinguished burns still, waiting for you to set it free.